Well, hello and welcome to Coffee House Questions. This is Ryan Pauly. One of the things that I try to focus on in the work that I do in my ministry with students is really trying to make apologetics practical and looking at the culture, the cultural issues that we are dealing with, and how can we train students really to engage the culture that they live in. Because if we're just taking this information and we're just kind of sitting in our rooms or our churches with it, and we're not actually taking it out, doing evangelism, engaging the culture, what is it really good for, except for just kind of bolstering our own kind of ideas and making us feel a little bit better as well. And so a great book that has just recently come out and that I had the chance to talk to the author about is Cultural Apologetics by Paul Gould. It is Cultural Apologetics, Renewing the Christian Voice, Conscience, and Imagination in a Disenchanted World. And so, Paul, thank you for coming on and joining me to discuss your work.
Yeah, you're welcome. It's great to be here with you, Ryan.
Yeah, so Paul graduated with his master's in philosophy of religion and ethics from Talbot School of Theology. I'm also a Talbot grad. Not philosophy of religion and ethics, but MA apologetics, but same school. But you also went on to get your PhD in philosophy at Purdue. Now you do a few different things. So you are the founder and president of Two Tasks Institute, as well as a visiting fellow at the Henry Center of Theological Understanding at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. And also, I think you are a professor at Oklahoma Baptist University.
Mm-hmm.
While all at the same time, you live in Texas.
That's right. Yes.
So
it's a crazy life.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit about how that works. You're living in Fort Worth, Texas, which I got family down there. Beautiful place.
Oh, cool.
I'm big. Nice. Are you a Rangers fan?
Actually, no. Sorry.
Oh,
I'm from the Midwest, so I'm going to stay loyal to Milwaukee Brewers.
Oh, Milwaukee. So, okay. All righty. Yep. All right. So my dad was born and raised Dallas, and so I grew up being a Rangers fan as well, or not as well, but as well as him. But anyways, so you live in Dallas, in Fort Worth, Texas. But you're a professor in Oklahoma, and you are a fellow at Trinity, which is in Illinois. How exactly does that work, and how did you get connected to these places?
Yeah, so actually, what brought us to Fort Worth for the last 5 years, for about 5 years, I taught at a local seminary called Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. And then I left there about 2 years ago. And so I've been teaching online with Oklahoma Baptist, so that's why I can do it from Fort Worth.
Perfect.
And then this year, as a visiting scholar at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School here in Chicago, I actually fly, which is what I just got. I just arrived in my apartment. I fly Monday to Chicago, and then I fly home on Thursday. And so it's kind of just for 1 year, but it's kind of a crazy, now that the snow's in, the travel days get a little longer. But that's how we do all these.
So every week you fly up there Monday, fly back Thursday.
For this year, yes.
Wow, that is quite a work. So what exactly are you working on at Trinity? I saw a little bit of some details, but what does that entail?
Yeah, so it's out of the Henry Center and the Creation Project, which they've got some funding, pretty good funding. And so the project I'm working on this year is, I'll start sort of big picture, then we could narrow down. But really what I'm interested in, and it'll connect with some of the things we'll talk about with respect to my book, I'm really interested in capturing the sacramental view of the world that was pretty much the way that everybody viewed the world for the first 1,500 years of the church's existence. And so to do that, the actual thing I'm working on is called Neo-Aristotelian accounts of divine creative activity. But basically what I'm trying to do is reappropriate some of the old ways of viewing the world and then bring them up to date with contemporary science and philosophy and metaphysics. So from that, got some technical work I'm doing in what's called Neo-Aristotelian metaphysics. And then I've got 2 book projects that I'm working on that are actually connected to some things that maybe I'll connect it to some parts of the book in a little bit, but 2 book projects as well.
Well, so I read that Neo-Aristotelian divine creation or something like that. And so what exactly does that mean?
Yeah, let's see here. It basically is the idea. So there's two competing views of the world when you talk about a philosophy of nature, or metaphysics is I know you know this, but the philosophical study of the world, and it's what exists and the structure of the world.
Yeah.
And so the dominant view that's at least been around since the Enlightenment is what's called today in the academy the neo-Humean view of the world, and that's basically the idea that the only kind of fundamental things that exist are the little BBs, the atoms, and then everything else are just built up out of the atoms, but they're nothing but physical, chemical molecules in motion. And then it's a very mechanistic view of the world. You kind of get the clockmaker image of the world, and that's the neo-Humean mosaic is what it's called.
Okay.
But what I'm interested in is a return to what's called the Neo-Aristotelian mosaic, And this is a more traditional view of viewing the world, where there's dependencies all throughout the world. There's things called substances, like you and I and oak trees and plants are actual substances that are fundamental wholes that aren't just reducible to their little BBs, the little atoms. And within that, you have things like teleology, which is just that fancy word for purpose or order. And instead of the clockmaker analogy to understand what this mosaic looks like, the medievals loved and used the phrase "the great chain of being." And the idea was that you have God sort of at the top, and then dangling down you have these orders of perfected beings, angels, and then in the universe you have humans, and then animals, and then plants, and then inanimate matter, and then non-being. And so it's kind of this idea that everything is structured, everything is ordered. There's this hierarchy of being, and it actually reflects. And then when you put your theology cap back on it, part of the question, why did God create, was to communicate his goodness. And he communicates that to creatures through making a world that reflects his goodness in all the various ways through that which he has made. So that's a little bit of what the Neo-Aristotelian mosaic that I'm interested in recapturing.
Perfect. Yeah, I read that and I was like, I got to figure out what that means a little bit more.
Yeah.
All right, so you've written this book, Cultural Apologetics, Renewing the Christian Voice, Conscience and Imagination in a Disenchanted World. And I originally heard about this book actually from Brett Kunkel, where he said, that he was buying everyone he knew a copy of this book. And I said, well, where's mine? And he goes, do I know you?
Oh, no.
Just classic Brett. Anyways, he was able to put us in contact and I was able to get it. So maybe from the beginning, people are going to say, okay, I know apologetics, but cultural apologetics, what is that?
Okay. Yeah, it's a good question. So apologetics, typically is understood as the rational defense of the faith or something like that, giving reasons for the truth of Christianity. And let me give you the backstory, actually, of what happened with this book. So, teaching at the seminary in Fort Worth years ago, I actually asked to teach a class called Cultural Apologetics. Hadn't been done yet at the seminary, but I was assigned to teach that. And then, of course, as any educator does, you Google the phrase to figure out what you're supposed to teach. So I Googled the phrase. This was like 6 years ago. What is cultural apologetics? And at the time, there was like nothing out there. And so all I did was that first year is gathered 7 books that I was interested in on culture, apologetics, and the gospel. And basically used it, I was teaching, but I used it as a research seminar to figure out what I was interested in. And then every year for about 5 years, I would cycle out those 7 books and put 7 new ones in. And finally, by about the 4th or 5th year, I started to realize, okay, this is what I mean by cultural apologetics. And so here's the definition that I came up with. And basically the idea is working to reestablish or renew the Christian voice, the Christian conscience, and the Christian imagination so that the gospel will be viewed as both true to the way the world is and true to the way the world ought to be. In other words, that it's not just true. We want to help people see that it's true and reasonable, but it's more than that. It's actually good and beautiful as well. And so that's kind of my working definition of cultural apologetics.
And how much would you say that apologists are focusing on this kind of definition? I know that in my work with Maven, we do focus on the true goodness and beauty, really trying to grab the 3 areas that really, entail the full view. But how many apologists maybe are focusing on all of it, or if it's simply just, let me just state that it's true, and then you should just want to believe it because I think generally apologist mindset is I enjoy truth and that's why I do this. And so everyone else is like me. So here's the truth. You should now just believe it versus adding in the goodness and the beauty as well.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I mean, I think you're right, Maven and Brett and you guys. I love the holistic approach that you have. I think that, and I'll just speak for myself. So I am a philosopher, and I love propositions. I love arguments. I traffic in arguments. That's what we do, right? But I just realized that there's more objections to Christianity than just the objection that it's not rational. And so I do think that the plank of reason, as I like to call it, is a well-walked plank among apologists. Like a lot of us are very comfortable there. Some of us are only comfortable there and nowhere else. And that's okay, actually. But I guess the proposal I want to say is, no, we've got so many more things at our disposal, epistemically, number one. And number two, there's so many other objections to our faith, especially in the West, which is, what I was thinking about as I wrote the book. And so there are people that are doing it. And I think what's interesting is I've noticed, and even in writing the book, there's people that are exploring other planks, as I would call it, other planks that we can build bridges to Jesus from our culture. There's people writing on moral apologetics. Think of Dave Baggett and Mary Beth Baggett and the folks over at moralapologetics.com, and they're really focused on that aspect. There's others like Holly Ordway at Houston Baptist University and others who are focused on the imaginative side. And with cultural apologetics, I want to honor all of those things, the rational, the emotional, the moral. But I also want to sort of enfold them into a theology of what culture is and what it means to be human in the midst of culture, and how culture actually shapes us. Well, I should say that we shape culture, and then culture in turn shapes us. And so I wanted to kind of incorporate it into that. And so let me just say one more thing, because I know I can get on tangents here, but
You're good.
The other thing with cultural apologetics that I don't think we're doing well, and this is a big part of the book, was I make a distinction between local and global. You could call it upstream and downstream apologetics. So if you think about culture, upstream you have the culture shaping institutions of the world. Mm-hmm. With respect to truth, it's the university. With respect to beauty, it's the arts, and with respect to goodness, it's the city. And then downstream, you have all these, the consumers of culture, the individual lives. And a cultural apologist is someone who actually works at both upstream and downstream, or global and local things. And that's a piece that I think we're drastically missing, not just as apologists, but as evangelicals. We tend to have a window of 4 years, or metrics, maybe gospel conversions and baptisms, which are all, of course, important, but we never focus on the long term. And part of the proposal that I'm arguing for is, no, we've got to be strategic, we've got to be wise, we've got to think about how culture is formed and things like that.
Perfect. Now, can you kind of go back over what you just said, just because you went quickly, and I just want to kind of, play this out a little bit more for those listening, as you talked about truth is found at the university. And I think, that's pretty self-explanatory. We understand why that is the way it is. Beauty in the arts. And we go, yeah, of course, art, beauty. But you said goodness is in the city. What do you mean by goodness in the city?
Yeah. So, okay. Yeah. Let me back up. So the question is, what domain within culture gets to tell us, what truth is, or what beauty is, or what goodness is? And so, like you said, the university pretty clearly is that place where knowledge, the people with the PhDs behind their name get to tell us the truth about the world, or at least what they think it is. And so too with the arts. With respect to goodness, the idea there with the city, and especially if you think about the 21st century and where culture is heading, we're moving away from the rural focus to a city focus in culture. And so this includes things like government, politics, law, all the things that are responsible for the infrastructure, the markets. Think of New York and Wall Street. That would be part of this as well. So the point is that as a cultural apologist, we need to be thinking strategically about how we can assert Christian leadership in those areas of cultural influence as well, so that Jesus and the gospel will be viewed as something that's good. So it's a debate about, there's so many debates about politics and faith, economics and faith. There's a raging, as you know, issue right now, or debate about social justice, but we own justice, right? That's all that stuff comes from us. So that's kind of the ideas. That area.
Well, it's so good to maybe remind Christians of that, in the sense that, it seems like people feel like, oh, if I want to be a social justice warrior, I need to get out of Christianity.
Right.
Versus you say, that really does provide that foundation. Now, you also mentioned in your book that, maybe this term cultural apologetics doesn't always have the best understanding, or not everyone is in agreement with it. And you did have a short little quote there by William Lane Craig. And I'm curious, is the quote where you kind of said, hey, he doesn't have the best view of this, would it be against how you define cultural apologetics? Or is he defining it in a different way and he's against that? And so if those listening go, well, I've heard of this thing, cultural apologetics, and people are not talking about it in a good way, are there different views of it? Or is he actually saying what you are talking about here would not be the best?
Yeah, no, and I don't think what I'm talking about here is something that Bill would take issue with. In fact, I'm almost positive that he wouldn't. In his book, Reasonable Faith, you mentioned the quote as I was writing and researching the book. He takes a pretty narrow view, and again, this you can't fault him. He can't know everything, right? But he took a pretty narrow view of what cultural apologetics was, and basically defined it as a kind of worldview analysis that is in the spirit of Francis Schaeffer, that simply critiques culture. And of course, that is part of any cultural apologetic approach, is that we need to understand the culture that we seek to reach. But my proposal is way broader than that. I think where Bill would be a great example, someone who's very comfortable and feels called only to walk that plank of reason. I don't think, and I've heard him, say in response to this, since he teaches now a little bit at Houston Baptist University, the kinds of things that I'm talking about, the kinds of things that Nancy Pearcey, for example, does, or Holly Ordway does, he would be all for that. It's
Yeah.
just not his cup of tea.
Okay.
Kind of where, yeah.
Perfect. So now, also in your in the foreword, it was written by J.P. Moreland. I love something that J.P. said there. Is he said our greatest need is to reintroduce believers to the value and practice of apologetics and to equip them to engage our culture's ideas in a winsome and intelligent way. And so I'm just curious then of taking this idea of where does apologetics come in to play when you're discussing beauty and the arts. That seems, maybe some go, no, that's disconnected. You have your arts and then you have your logic and reason. How are these two things connected?
Yeah. So this was the big aha moment for me, and it's I don't have the book with me, so you'll know the chart if you've read it already. So I was reading Peter Kraft in his book Back to Virtue, and he had a chart there where he talked about how God has given us three prophets of the human soul. He's given us reason, he's given us the conscience, and he's given us the imagination.
Hmm.
And then the thing that was so helpful and that actually pulled a lot together for me was this, this idea that reason, each of these is on a quest for the object of their longing, of their desire. So, for example, reason is on a quest for truth, and the conscience is on a quest for goodness, and the imagination is on a quest for beauty. And then if you put our theology cap on, and ask the question, well, what is the source of all goodness, truth, and beauty? Well, the answer, as Kraft put it, was Christ. And he's right, of course. One of my favorite quotes in Augustine's Confessions is in Book 3, where he basically says of God, you are the beauty of all beautiful things. And then he says, you are the good of all good things. And I would just add the truth in which all true things point. And so the connection is this, that if you think about the longings of the heart that every human has because they're implanted in our heart by God, well, we can use those deep longings of the heart to awaken people and then set them on a quest that has Christ as the end, or the telos, or the purpose, the source of that longing. And so that's a little bit about how I'm envisioning, just at a purely pictorial level,
Yeah.
what it means to sort of walk the plank of the imagination on the way to beauty, which finds Christ as a result.
Yeah, that's a good chart. I have it right here. And it is a very good visual of understanding, really, of even just the goal of apologetics, and everything that we do is pointing people back to Christ and pointing people to the gospel. Now, you bring up the ideas of, I mean, the first thing is really understanding the culture that we live in, and the need for that, and really kind of relate it to kind of a missionary way of thinking, which I really relate to because I was a missionary overseas for 4 years, and so knowing the training that goes into learning the language and learning things about the culture, and then just even being in the culture. I remember thinking, if I my the initial commitment was only 4 months, and thinking when I ended up moving it to 1 year, which then became 4 years.
Wow. Nice.
When I reached the end of my 4 months, I thought, wow, if I was going home today, I wouldn't have done a whole lot, because this first 4 months was mainly learning, was mainly growing, was building relationships. I didn't accomplish things that you would think a missionary really does accomplish. And you kind of bring up you bring up Leslie Newbigin, which would be interesting why and who that is, but of really asking the question, what would be involved in a missionary encounter between the gospel and this whole way of perceiving, thinking, and living that we call the modern Western world. So, who is Leslie Newbigin, and kind of how do you relate this to this missionary understanding of how do we bring the gospel in?
Yeah, that was another really sort of pulling the pieces together moment for me as I was thinking. Well, I've been wrestling with these. I was a campus minister with Cru for 16 years prior to becoming a professor, and so a lot of what I'm wrestling with is just the question I've been wrestling with for the last 20 years on the college campus. How does the gospel get a fair hearing in our today's culture? Yeah. But Newbigin is interesting because so in 1936 he was sent from Great Britain to India to preach the gospel to the Hindus. And he faithfully ministers there for 40 years. In I think it was like 74, he comes back to Great Britain, and he realizes in the time that he was away, his own sending country had become, as he would call it, post-Christian. And so in the 70s, he began to wrestle with this question, how do we have a genuine missionary encounter with our own culture, which for him, again, was Great Britain. And so he asked that question that you just read, what would be involved in a genuine missionary encounter and I loved how he says it. He says, between the whole way of perceiving, thinking, and living that we call modern Western culture and the gospel.
Yeah.
And I think that's such a great question. So I call it New Begins question. And really that's the crucial question, I think, in a post-Christian age that all of us need to be asking. And of course, New Begin understood that it's not the ultimate question, right? It's the penultimate question. The ultimate question is that we want every person to ask is, what do you make of Jesus Christ? But what was so brilliant about New Begin is he understood that the gospel was never proclaimed in a vacuum, and that there's this cultural mindset, and there's this sort of cultural conscience, and there's this cultural imagination that actually informs whether the gospel will be viewed as plausible or implausible, desirable or undesirable, or either, neither. And so that was another big sort of piece that I feel like God just dropped a few things to help my own thinking, sort of dropped them right in my lap, and New Begin was a big part of that.
Okay. And what you just said right there is just when we're presenting this in culture, is it going to be plausible, implausible? Is it even going to be good? I know Sean McDowell often says, the question that students are asking these days is not necessarily is Christianity true, but is it good? That's really something they're focusing on. But in my interview that I did with JP Moreland, we talked a little bit about plausibility structures. Can you just explain for yourself a little bit what you mean by if our culture is even looking at this as being plausible?
Yeah.
And how that affects our witness.
Yeah, and I think it might have even been, I know we both, know JP and taken classes. Have you taken classes?
I never had him as a professor, but I know him and have interviewed him.
Okay, good. Yeah, so he's kind of like a fire hydrant. So I might have heard this from him at some point. But, if you think about it, so just think about it in the context of, like, for example, when I was a campus minister, walking around a college campus, if I would walk to the local university and I'd say there were all these signs and they said something like, come hear what the Flat Earth Society has to say about the nature of the world, or like, no one would care what the Flat Earth Society has to say, right?
I might be interested just to hear their reasons.
Right. Yeah. So we'd go.
But I'm weird like that.
Joke.
Yeah.
Yeah. Totally. We'd go because, like, what the heck is this for real? But nobody would go because they actually take it seriously.
Yeah.
And the thing is, the unfortunate truth is so often, especially on our college campuses, but not just there. If we do an outreach, and we say something like, "Come hear what Jesus Christ has to say about the nature of the world," well, people just don't care. It sounds like that flat Earth sign sounds to us, and so.
But to us, it's the most important thing, and so we go, "Why would they not care about this?"
Right. And that's why the plausibility structures matter. Like, so, Peter Berger is the person who coined that phrase. And it's just the idea that every culture, actually not every culture does, but every person has a plausibility structure as well. And all that is that basically that set of beliefs that someone is or is not willing to consider as plausibly true. And so the point is, as a cultural apologist, or really just as an apologist in general, if we don't pay attention to the conditions, the soil, the things that are plausible or implausible, there's no way that we're going to, the gospel is even downstream of that. And so we've got to sometimes back up and work on some pre-evangelism, sometimes we might call it, but some of the prior issues that inform these kind of issues.
Yeah, I feel like I deal with that with my students, as those listening know, but I teach an international school where most of the students are not Christians, about 70% non-Christians, and I teach apologetics and worldview and ethics.
Oh, fun.
And and it's amazing, but they often come into my sophomore / junior class is the apologetics class, and they often come into that class only having, a survey of biblical literature where they do go over reasons, and it's an amazing class, but they kind of come in like, I just don't, this stuff is all nonsense. I don't believe any of it. And it's amazing that after we spend chapters on why we think the Bible is the Word of God, on the internal and external evidence for the Bible's authority. And I just finished The Existence of God this last week, and it's amazing reading my students' writings as they go, this actually is starting to make sense. Like, this actually, there are actually reasons for this. And it just changes that framework to where now Jesus becomes a little bit different in their mind. When now we're going to talk about the evidence for the resurrection coming up starting tomorrow. And it's just like, it's one of those things. It's so cool just changing that plausibility structure to where this it went from this myth that is just grounded in nothing to there's actually good reasons to believe it's true.
Yeah. And that's great. Like, I love, you don't always need to do this, but it certainly helps if God exists, right? Well, then something like the resurrection is at least possible.
Yeah.
And so that's a great example of, people talk about two-step apologetics, where you first argue for the existence of God and then for the truth of the resurrection of Christ. And that's a great example of one way, especially in a post-biblical culture, post-Christian culture, to help people see, okay, wait, this stuff isn't totally crazy and things like that. So that's really cool that you get to do that.
Yeah. So in our last, we have about 3 or 4 minutes before we're going to take a break. But you talked about, or even in the section with Leslie Newbegin, how can we talk about Jesus in a way that is understood by those becoming further and further removed from the language and worldview of Christianity? And so, thinking, do you have maybe some funny or some good examples of what would be a really bad way to try to talk about Jesus to people who don't understand, and what would be a better way to try to engage people with the gospel?
Well, I'll just share embarrassing, learning from experience here. I'll tell you a way not to do it is to never listen and simply get your argument out. That's the quickest way to turn off somebody, and I've done that. I'm guilty of that. And I actually had one guy. I think I might have even shared it in the book there, but I can remember because it was such a convicting thing. He was an atheist. Cool, I've got an atheist. We were sitting in a dining hall in a dorm, and I whipped out a napkin and was walking through the Kalam cosmological argument, so excited, to show him clearly that God exists. And he just sat back after a while and said, "Paul, can you just stop? Basically he didn't say it this way, but you're just not scratching where I itch." And the point was I wasn't listening. Yeah. And then I just put my pen down, put the napkin down, and listen. And then for 30 minutes, he just went off on, just poor father relationships and totally missed. And so I think probably the thing I've learned, we've just got to listen, number one. I could say more, but I know we're out of time. But yeah, that would be the thing that popped into my mind right away.
So listening and really kind of addressing the issues that they have.
That's right. Yeah. That's right. Yeah. Seeking first to understand, and then we can move, whether even just with the questions sometimes, the best thing is just ask, why do you think that? And then that opens up a whole set of dialogues because you shifted the burden of proof onto them to defend their view as plausible and reasonable and desirable. And so that kind of thing has been really helpful.
Yeah. And I talk a lot about on this show, I talk about tactics and, I work alongside Stand to Reason as well. But just recently had a guy on my YouTube channel just really come down hard how stupid it is for Christians to not believe in evolution. And I said, well, what do you mean by evolution? And the way that he defined it, I agreed with every single bit of his point. And I said, oh, if that's the definition of evolution, we're in agreement here. And he goes, well, no, you Christians disagree. You believe intelligent design. I said, no, intelligent design doesn't disagree with how you just defined evolution. I said, we're in agreement here. And he's like, and then it just kind of drops off. But just again, asking those questions. What do you mean by that? How did you come to that conclusion? What is going on in your life? And it's amazing. I think even being as a teacher, just, learning the backstory behind some of the students and going, okay, I read that one very wrong. I just assumed they were lazy or something and they just weren't doing the work. And man, there really are some deeper things going on that need to be addressed. And it's so important for us, if we're going to reach people with the message of Jesus and the gospel, to really understand the people that we are reaching. And so we're going to come back in our second part and discuss ways that we can address the issues in our culture today. So, Paul, thanks for joining me in this first part.
You're welcome.
All righty.
Good.
We are good.
All right.
So I just do, I don't remember if I told you, but I do 30 minutes a week. So when I get interviews like this, it turns into 2 weeks, and it's good.
Two for one.
Yeah, that's the time slot I have on the radio station, and so it works out well. So all right, we'll jump into part two.
Are you on the radio?
Yeah, 100.1 KGBA.
Oh, how fun!
Yeah,
it's like an LA thing or something.
It's actually it's southeast of it's not southeast but southeast of me, east of San Diego.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah, kind of the Mexicali, Calexico area. So I did a speaking event down there, and they enjoyed it. And the little local radio station said, "Hey, can we pick you up on Saturday night?" So yeah,
that's awesome.
Good as well. So yeah, absolutely. All right, well, let's jump in part two. Hello and welcome to Coffee House Questions. This is Ryan Pauly, and this is part two of a discussion that we started last week with Paul Gould on his book, Cultural Apologetics, Renewing the Christian Voice, conscience, and imagination in a disenchanted world. And in case you missed it, Dr. Paul Gould is a professor at Oklahoma Baptist University. He's also a visiting fellow at Henry Center for Theological Understanding at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, and has his PhD in philosophy from Purdue University and a master's from Talbot School of Theology. And so, Paul, thanks for spending another 30 minutes with me here.
You're welcome. It's great to be with you.
Awesome. So we left off last part just discussing really the kind of plausibility structures and really helping people see Jesus and really understanding the person. And I think that's so important of just kind of figuring out who they are and where they're coming from when we're doing this. And so we recognize, though, in your book, Cultural Apologetics, is really we're trying to impact and influence the culture. And we have to know what's going on in this culture. What are the influences of our culture? And actually, in preparation for this, I threw out a little survey on my Instagram saying, how well do you think Christians know the culture that they are trying to engage? And of the people that responded, the average answer was about a 3 out of 10. That Christians really don't understand the culture they're trying to engage. So what is going on with the culture that we're living in right now? What are some of the major influences that are affecting it?
Okay. Yeah, that's a great question. I love that you did that. 3 out of 10 sounds pretty high. So just from teaching and knowing that students are very not aware of things, that sounds like a pretty high even. Yeah, I think, okay, what's going on in the culture? Oh, man. I think, so in the book, just because I think this is such a helpful framing thing, I gave 3 words, and so you'll know where I'm headed here. I gave 3 words to answer Newbegin's question. Remember from last week, Leslie Newbegin asked this great question, how can we have a genuine missionary encounter with the whole way of perceiving, thinking, and living that we call modern Western culture and the gospel? And so so to describe the dominant way of thinking, or I'm sorry, perceiving in the world, the word that I would use is disenchanted. So here's some ways to understand our Athens, our culture, at least in the West. The dominant way of perceiving is disenchanted. And what I mean by that is that we no longer see the world, and I mean this for Christians as well, we no longer see the world in its proper light. So, for example, we use words like the world is ordinary, or it's everyday, or it's mundane. But that's actually not the way the world is, right? The world is, biblically, the world is a gift, and it's sacred, and it's holy, and it's mysterious, and all these things. And so that's the first word, is disenchanted. And we can unpack that even more. That's a key phrase that I work with in the book. The question, what is the culture's dominant way of thinking? In a word, the word would be sensate, but it just means we're fixed on the sensory, the material, the physical. I love, if your listeners are familiar with C.S. Lewis's, devilish little book, Screwtape Letters, where you have a senior devil, fictitious account, senior devil, tutoring a junior devil. And in the very first letter, the senior devil says to the junior devil, your business is to fix their mind on the stream of immediate sensual experience. And that's a great description of our world right now, fixed on the immediate stream of sensual experience. And actually, in the book, he goes, don't awaken their minds, and because then they'll pertain to universal matters, and they'll realize they can win on the enemy's ground, which is our reason. And so, yeah, we're fixed on the physical, the sensory. And then in terms of that, what is our dominant way of living? In a word, it would be hedonism. And again, that's just the idea that we go from one bite-sized packet of pleasure to another bite-sized packet of pleasure. As again, Lewis would put it, we're addicted to Turkish delights, if you remember that from The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And that's kind of how, those are maybe some quick words that help us understand just a little bit about where folks are in culture. Of course, we can go a lot deeper, but that's at least a good starting point.
Yeah, and so when you talked about this idea of how we perceive the world and that we are disenchanted, in kind of a response to it, you discuss this idea that we have this longing for truth, and that as Christians, then we then give reason in response. But I when I read that, I went, I do think that's true, but how many people actually care about this longing for truth that they have inside of them? And these kind of longings, when I pointed out, I think, man, there's so many people that are just so apathetic that, whatever, I know I want justice, but it's that's never going to happen. So I'm over it. I'm just going to have fun. How do you really get people to truly recognize and acknowledge this longing that they have inside of them?
Yeah, that's great. Well, this is part of my positive proposal in the book, actually, is that we've got to, as a cultural apologists, we've got to shock people into engagement with reality. And so think of it this way. Think of the set of desires that every person has. Like think of your own life and, the set of your desires or longings. Think of it as an inverted triangle, right? So at the top of that triangle, you have like your surface desires. And then as you drill down to the bottom, you have deeper desires. And then right at the bottom, you have, of course, the heart's deepest desire. As Augustine would said, our hearts are restless until they find rest in you. So the deepest desire of every human heart is the longing for God, is relationship with God, is union with God. But right above that deepest desire, the bottom of the triangle, I would put all those other desires that we like to talk about: goodness, the longing for goodness, truth, beauty, justice, love, and things like that. So they're right above the deepest desire, and they're innate in every human heart. And so it's not, you're right. The world has deadened desire, right? We don't use our minds, and so we're not awakened to the longing for truth. We don't, seek justice or live whole, and so our minds we're not awakened to that longing for goodness. But part of what we can do is reawaken those, and I offer lots of ideas on how to do that. But that's part of the cultural apologist's job. In a world full of apathy, our job is partly to poke and prod and reawaken these things that we know are already there, because this is how God has made each of us. So, I could say a lot more, but that's the big picture idea, is that they are there, and part of our job is to reawaken them. And we do that through, the stories we tell, the music that we make, the arguments that we give, the life that we live, the kind of life, the wholeness that we have, and things like that. So
Okay.
those are some of the ways that we do it.
And I know one of the, even apologetic argument for this is kind of C.S. Lewis's argument for desire, and I haven't really gone over that much on the show. Could you maybe say a few things about this argument for desire that Lewis kind of presented?
Yeah, that's it's one of my favorite arguments, actually, for God. And Lewis, of course, was fascinated with desire. He thought that, if you read his autobiography, Surprised by Joy, he talks about how at a very early age, at age 6, actually, he was exposed to deep beauty, and that it awoken something within him, and it set him on a journey that terminated, in his 30s when he found Christ. But he talked about reading fairy stories at 16, George MacDonald's Fantasties, that awoke. He said it rebaptized his imagination. And so everything he loved and thought dear was in the land of poetry and fairy stories. But then his, logic professor was telling him there was no God. And so everything that he thought was true was cold and calculating. And so he talks about how he had these two hemispheres of his mind. And it wasn't until he'd found that Christianity was true myth, as he called it, or true story, that he was able to basically unite those two hemispheres. So Lewis was fascinated with Christianity as the perfect blend of reason and romance. So within that, then he in a lot of his works, he would advance what's called the argument from desire. And it wasn't original to him, but he popularized it in a lot of ways. You can see this for your listeners, if you're interested. There's 3 places that he talks about it prominently. One is the chapter in Mere Christianity on Hope. The second place is the essay, The Weight of Glory. And the third place is actually the afterword to his first book that he wrote after he became a Christian, that's partly autobiographical, called A Pilgrim's Regress. He has an afterword where he interacts with the argument from desire as well. But it basically goes like this, or actually here's a quote, one of my favorite quotes from the chapter on hope in Mere Christianity. You can kind of see how the argument would go. But he basically says, if you find something within ourselves that nothing in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that you're made for another world. So that's basically, the argument is, hey, we have these desires, natural desires in our heart. They're things that can't be satisfied in this world, but every natural desire has an object that satisfies it. Therefore, there's some object beyond this world. That object is God. And I actually formalize that and kind of unpack that and argue for it in the book. But that's the gist of what's going on there.
And have you seen this argument be persuasive? It seems to be more, I don't know the right word I'm looking for, but it's maybe not as concrete as a Kalam argument or something with
more feelings.
It's more feeling based. And it's like, well, you just feel like that there's something that satisfies your desire, but you can't actually know that there's something that satisfies this desire.
That's right. Yeah. It's interesting. So one of the things that JP taught me early, maybe you've heard him say it, is that if we want to be good thinkers, we need to learn to make distinctions. And then if we want to be good teachers, we need to learn to teach distinctions. And I think with the argument from desire, when you make some key distinctions about what Lewis, for example, meant by a natural desire as opposed to an artificial desire, and what Lewis meant by the transcendent desire versus, the surface desires or other desires, the argument is surprisingly strong, actually. Um, you know, yeah, and so the premises, if you set them out, the way that I formulate it in the book, there's basically three key premises that you need to defend. And arguably, every one of those premises, when you make those critical distinctions to understand what we're talking about, surprisingly are stronger than you might think at first approach. So yeah, will it convince everyone? Probably not, but no argument convinces everyone.
Yeah.
But is it useful? Is it helpful? Especially in an age where we're so driven by our desires? Yeah, it's really interesting because what it does, I love, like in the Gospel of John, the first thing that Jesus says, is not what do you believe, Andrew, but what do you want? And this is such a great question for us, and that's why I love it. Is it in some ways it goes, it doesn't run around the logic chopping, which I love to do, by the way, and I think we should do that well. But it doesn't run around that because suddenly we're thinking about our own hearts and the set of our desires and just one particular desire, and maybe we're not aware of it. But when we start to talk and give an argument, people start to realize, wait a minute, I see that in my own heart.
Yeah.
They might not. That's part of the problem with it sometimes, but we can help there.
Yeah, and like I said, this is one argument that I haven't spent that much time in, and I don't formulate it very well. I mention it from time to time when I'm with my students, but I did have one student. I think it does relate to the argument where we went over this idea of what is true justice, and the fact that we desire justice to take place. We want there to be justice, and when there's not fairness, when we get mad about it, and maybe that's because there is something inside of us that there is true justice coming from God that will satisfy it, and we are built for that, and that's why we want it. And that to him was something I didn't realize it till later on. He said, that idea of justice was really impactful. In him trying to understand this idea of Christianity, and still not a Christian, but really like that's a point of this idea of justice that we desire. And so, that it hits home for different people.
Yeah.
Right. So if we use a range of arguments,
yeah,
they're all persuasive different amounts.
Yeah, here's the beauty of it. So go back to that triangle, again, the inverted triangle where you have our deepest desire for God at the bottom, but then right above it, you have these deep desires for goodness, truth, beauty, love, justice. And so like maybe people aren't aware of that deepest desire of the heart. That's okay. Go up one stage because actually Lewis in The Weight of Glory, he does the argument from desire, but he focuses on beauty. So he goes above the deepest desire. In the chapter on hope, he focuses on the deepest desire. In the chapter on heaven and the problem of pain, he talks about all those deep desires right above the deepest desire. And so you're right. I think that that's exactly right. People, they might not see that deepest longing, but they do want truth. Or if they don't want truth, if they don't know that, they do want justice. And if they don't know that, they do want beauty, or they want love. And those are right above it. And you can run these same arguments for desire for any of those, and get the same result.
Yeah. So moving along, you talked about how does our culture think, and that we're sensate. And to this, you kind of you gave the response of this longing that we have for goodness, and the response is our conscience. And so, how does our longing for goodness there? What do you mean by goodness in a response to a culture of how we think?
Yeah, I parse out our longing for goodness into three sub-longings in the book. So our longing for goodness is composed of our longing to become whole. So, for example, we want to have all our thinkings and willings and belief all headed in the right direction. We don't want to be fragmented. So our longing for wholeness. Number two, our longing for justice. We want to see a world made right. And then number three, our longing for significance. That we want to live a life that matters. And so that's what I'm thinking about with the longing for justice. And of course, walking that plank of the conscience would involve, as a cultural apologist, would involve being a certain kind of person, that's pursuing Christ and wholeness, seeking justice, as Micah, 7:18 says, living justly, seeking mercy, and so on. And then living for a story greater than self, that these things actually, I think they pull people out of their own lives and help us see that there is a story that's alive and well. And so that's what I'm thinking about there.
Okay.
on that.
And then the idea of how we live, talking about this hedonistic view and this longing for beauty that we have, and the imagination and the Christian imagination. And you talk about this, that the imagination is focusing on beauty and theater and dance and art. And how can Christians do a better job at the? Well, maybe I should ask this question: do you think Christians are doing a good job focusing on the beauty and the arts and theater and dance in the first place?
Yeah, I think I'm super encouraged with what Christians are doing at the moment. There's some really, I think, excellent revival and recapturing of the arts and the beauty and the imagination in the Christian tradition. I'm thinking of people like Andrew Peterson and the Rabbit Room and the stuff that he's doing. I'm thinking of, for example, the Anselm Society, which is out of Colorado Springs, and the kinds of things they're doing where they're recapturing the arts for the church and the idea of doing theology through the arts. So I'm encouraged by a lot of that. I will say, though, historically, that the church beauty has been in exile in the church, I think, especially in evangelicalism. And so, we're kind of confused on what beauty is and the importance of it in our lives. And so many of our churches are multi-purpose buildings, and we worship in bland, gymnasiums, and it doesn't activate our hearts. It doesn't activate our sense of beauty in a way that I think a Gothic, I don't know, chapel would, or something like that. And so I think we're doing well, but I think we have a long way to go as well.
And in this kind of the beauty in the arts, I personally, I think in my experience of if you were an artist, if you were a creative, maybe you played on the worship team and that's about it.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that I even had one student who was really upset because he's a movie producer. He's, really focused on just, the arts and movies and animation, and everything. And just said, there's not a place for me in Christianity.
Yeah.
And how kind of that fits in. And so, what do we say to the creative individual in the church?
Man, yeah, it hurts to hear that. I would just say to him and to those like him that we need, the church needs you. The church needs artists, and the artist and artists need the church. We need, both they need the church and we need them. And so we've just got to affirm, it's just the idea of calling that God has created each of us. We're not all, to use a metaphor of the body, we're not all eyes, we're not all arms, we're not all elbows. God has created, and many of us, to be creatives and to write poetry and to write stories and to make movies and to tell a better story. And we've got to affirm them because, again, like everything, we own it, right? Art and beauty belongs to us. The source is Christ. And so when we, separate that stuff out from the so-called spiritual disciplines, number one, we're falling into that sacred secular split. And number two, we're just not, we're missing an opportunity to affirm a calling that is good and valuable and so important for the sake of the gospel too. So yeah, I would just say we need to affirm and really support them.
And what would you then say to the church of how to improve and bring in the creatives as well as an aspect of beauty to a pastor that's listening here?
I would say I would encourage them. Even in my book, I unpack Exodus 31 and God's call to Moses to build the tabernacle, and God calls actually in names to the artist by name. And it's the first time you read in Scripture someone is filled with the Holy Spirit. And there, in the Old Testament, that the idea is that they're empowered to do the thing that God wants them to do. But what's so interesting is you look at Exodus 31 and the tabernacle. What you see there is that God cares about beauty, and in fact, the tabernacle is fashioned as a reminder of Eden, and not just a reminder of Eden and the deep beauty there, the beauty, order, and abundance that we had there, but it also is a reminder of our future. Where our lives will be with full of beauty, order, and abundance. And so I would just say, cultivate a theology of beauty, and maybe start with my chapter and folks like David Taylor, who is writing on theology and the arts in the church, as well as Andrew Peterson. He's got a book that comes out, it might even be out already, on creativity and art in the church. And so I would just encourage them to start listening to the dialogue and realizing that this is a rich stream of Christian thought that we've lost, but we've got to recapture.
Okay. Now, one last category of people, and that would be the one that I fall in. who is
Yeah.
not a creative, who has no artistic skills, who has no imagination in that sense, how can people like me help focus on the imagination and on beauty and culture when it comes so difficult?
Yeah, well, here's the thing: is you are actually because if you think about it, Genesis 1, God, what is God doing in Genesis 1? He's creating and he's cultivating the good, the true, and the beautiful. Right? He's putting order and abundance and boundaries and delineating and defining, and then he creates man and women in the image of a creating and cultivating God. And so, part of what it means to be created in the image of God is that we too are makers and creators of the good, the true, and the beautiful. And so I would just say, yeah, you're right. Not all of us are called to like do art for like our money, profession. But you can incorporate it in the things that you do, whether it's the teaching, the PowerPoint presentation that you do, or the mowing of your lawn, or the making of that tomato sandwich, or the everyday beauty that we all have. Like do things with beauty in mind, to the level of our ability. And so that's been a real challenge for me too. Like I'm not super creative, but I'm actually realizing I have more creative juice than I realize. And I think that's probably true for all of us, right? That because God has created us to be people who are nourished on the good, the true, and the beautiful, and then nourish others with
Yeah.
that. So yeah.
Yeah, so my focus has always been just helping students recognize the importance
Yeah.
of this, and
That's right.
showing movie clips in my talk on entertainment,
Good.
showing movie clips, and having them recognize what is true here, what is it saying is good, what is beautiful, and I think what we maybe I'm wrong on this, but it seems like Hollywood focuses on entertaining. They don't necessarily
Mhm.
care about truth or what's good, and Christians oftentimes focus on, well, what is good,
Yeah. Yeah.
and kind of maybe in what, or maybe even just what's true.
That's
And
true.
we
Yeah.
presented Jesus in this movie, and therefore it's a good movie and it's beautiful. And it's like, man, we should be the best movie producers. We should
Right.
be the best songwriters. It's really
Mhm.
grabbing that heart, and that deepest longing and desire that we have is what should come out from that. And just we have that ability. We
That's right.
need to go after it. Um, Now, you also talk about, okay, so with reason we are focusing on truth, and so the logic and the evidence and all that kind of comes out, and you go through, actually I'm going to skip that, I'm running out of time. This is so good. Now, so we've kind of diagnosed the culture a little bit. We've seen the disenchantment of our culture, and kind of what are some of the, maybe let me ask this really quick before we move on, is what are some of the culture shaping institutions that you kind of talk about?
Yeah. Yeah, and like we said in the first part, I think a nice way to categorize it is with respect to goodness, truth, and beauty. The university for truth, the arts for beauty, and then the city for goodness. And within the city, that includes clearly the government, clearly politics and law, and then the market. So Madison Avenue, Wall Street, and so on.
So helping
Right.
our students then recognize and say, "Hey, look, these places, the university, the arts, Hollywood, government and whatnot, these are shaping the way we think about money, the way we think
Right.
about sexuality, the way we think about the world, whether we like it or not. We need to be aware of this, right? And training them to kind of keep their eyes open a little bit. And so maybe
Yeah,
is there
some
a
of
short
that
way that we do that?
Yeah, some of that faded out because of our internet connection.
Okay.
But what I would say is, so if that's how culture is shaped, well, we need to have a seat at the table
Hmm.
in all of those
Yeah.
culture shaping institutes. There's this great book by James Davidson Hunter called "To Change the World," where he basically says, "Hey, we're going about as Christians, we're going about world change all wrong." He says the common view is bottom up. Change enough individual lives, and eventually you'll change the culture. But he went through and said culture is rarely, if ever, changed bottom up. He said it's always top down, where people that exist on the fringe of these culture shaping institutions are able to exert control. I'm sorry, exert influence, and that's how culture changes. And I think that that's really helpful for us. Like I don't know how culture change. Like I don't know how we change culture, but I do know this: if we're concerned about the plausibility, like we talked about last time, and the desirability of the gospel, we've got to be in those institutions where the plausibility and the desirability is formulated
Yeah.
and developed. And that's why we have to, for some of us, not for all of us, we have to affirm those who are called to the academy. We have to, and who are Christians. We have to affirm those who are called to be artists and Christians. We have to affirm those who are called to government and politics and so on. Because otherwise we, cede that dialogue to the secularist or, to others, and we don't even have a place at the table.
Absolutely. So we have about 4 minutes left, and I want to finish with this. What you presented of, even if we do this, it's not necessarily going to be perfect because there are things that are blocking people from Jesus and the gospel, right? That there are both internal and external blocks or barriers keeping people from seeing Jesus. And obviously, there's ways that we go about it, and doing what we do kind of helps remove those barriers. But can you maybe take our last few minutes and talk about the difference in what are internal and external barriers to keep people from seeing Jesus that we need to know about and how to relate to those?
Yeah, that's good. So in the book, I'm unpacking. I begin by looking at Paul at Mars Hill and how he engaged those not like him. Basically, he was Jewish and he's engaged in the Greek mindset. So how do we engage a culture not like our own? He does it brilliantly. He walks the plank of reason. He walks the plank of the imagination, quoting a poet and philosophers from their culture. He's living a life, walking the plank of conscience. And then he's addressing barriers along the way. And so the model that I unpack is that we basically need to be like Paul. We need to understand our culture. We need to build a bridge to Jesus and the gospel from our culture. And then we need to address barriers along the way. And so I talk about two kinds of barriers. Some are internal. Those are barriers that have to do with us, Christians, that we need to get our own house together. And some are external, meaning that they're out there in culture that we need to learn, be ready to respond to. Internally, the three that I talk about and the ones I'm most concerned with are three. Number one, anti-intellectualism that is rampant in the church. And so the call, just to encourage us to love God with our minds and all of our being, as Jesus says in the Great Commandment. The second internal barrier that we've got to get a grasp on is this fragmentation. In many ways, we're just as fragmented as our non-believing neighbor. Yet God has called us to be set apart and to be different, to be holy. And so seeking and pursuing Christ in wholeness would be something that's internal. And then the third thing, I call it rebaptizing the imagination. I know we didn't talk a lot about it, but just the idea of learning to see and delight in the world the same way that Jesus does. And so there's a whole important piece, and that's part of what the future books that I'm working on is related to that. And then in terms of the external, real quickly, just thinking through what are the obstacles or objections that are out there right now in your culture. So in the book, I unpack 4. In 20 years, they might be different, but the big idea is, whatever it is that are keeping people from Christ, we've got to be up to speed on those. And we love others in being up to speed with those so that we can address them with truth and do it in grace and in love.
Yeah. And, interview I did with Frank Turk not long ago, someone wrote in a question for him and pretty much was just very upset by the anti-intellectualism in the church and wanted to know what Frank's thoughts were on that and how to respond. And you talked about really getting people to understand, to love God with their mind. In our last maybe 30 seconds of, how would you encourage those listening to truly love God with their mind?
I would say realize that part of what it means to be an apprentice of Jesus Christ is to embrace the life of the mind. And that means that in everything that we do, in everything that we read, when we study the molecule, you're studying, ask yourself, what do we learn about the God of the molecule? When you read a great work of literature, ask, how do you hear the voice of God in this literature? And so on. So it's just seeing everything as gift and making Christ as Lord of all, including our minds, which is, of course, hard work, but it's part of what it means to be a follower of Christ.
That's so good. Paul, where can they go to find more about your books, your writing, your blogs, and where you're speaking and traveling to?
Yeah, you can go to, I've got a couple websites, paul-gould.com. You can keep up with books and happenings there. twotasksinstitute.org is a website for an organization that I work with as well. And those would probably be the two places. You find me on Facebook, find me on Twitter. You can follow me. I'll friend you. I'm happy to talk to you at any time.
Perfect. Thank you so much. This is just a fascinating conversation. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having me on, Ryan.
Yeah.